In my opinion, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, is maintaining its authority as the premier aviation regulatory agency. But the crown is slipping. The days of gold standard aviation regulatory excellence, of leading the world in developing oversight and surveillance standards, are being undermined by politics and the erosion of meritocracy. These radical changes are aggressively weakening FAA integrity and how oversight is conducted. They are affecting the FAA's standing in the aviation industry. My name is Stephen Carbone, and this is By Reason of Air Safety. If you go to the FAA website and look under Mission, the FAA's mission statement reads, "Our continuing mission is to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world." That's quite a logical mission statement. All safety and efficiency sends chills up your spine. But is the FAA true to its mission? Maybe we should understand what makes the FAA tick. And if so, we need to dive into two different codes of federal regulations, also known as the CFRs. We're going to discuss the mandated difference between the FAA and other transportation agencies like the NTSB, which we'll be discussing in Episode 3. Those two CFRs are Title 49, Transportation, and Title 14, Aeronautics and Space. Now, Title 49 will be discussed in Episode 3 when we talk about the NTSB. Why? Because Title 49 covers all transportation disciplines, which in addition to aviation are pipeline, highway, rail, and marine. So we'll stick with Title 14 for this episode, specifically Chapter 1, which is the FAA's jurisdiction. Title 14, Chapter 1, focuses on FAA responsibilities. We won't go into each part, but we'll help the listeners understand what falls under the FAA's jurisdiction, like Title 14, CFR, Subchapter B, as in Baker. These are the procedural rules, specifically Part 11, which is general rulemaking procedures, and Part 13, which is investigative and enforcement procedures. Subchapter B is important for how the FAA conducts oversight. For instance, Part 11, rulemaking, deals with changing the intent of a regulation and the procedures that must be followed to accomplish this. Why? Because rules aren't changed arbitrarily. Well, what does it take to change the intent of a rule? It's what's called a 5x5 event. This means it takes 5 years and $5 million to change the intent of a regulation. Whether it's by adding a comma or removing a word, the intent of the rule will be changed. Why is a rule change so important? Because a change in rules can put people out of business or cost them millions of dollars in modifications. We'll talk more about this in future episodes. Meanwhile, Part 13, investigative and enforcement procedures, are the FAA's big stick. Part 13 ensures certificate holders understand they can be investigated and financially penalized by the FAA for any violated regulations. Title 14 CFR, Subchapter C, as in Charlie, talks about aircraft. It addresses certification of aircraft, engines, propellers, articles, components, and products. These are the certification and airworthiness standards for all aircraft of all types, such as transport and normal category. These are engineering rules. And we're going to pause here. Congress, the NTSB, and the mainstream media do not understand the FAA is made up of different aviation specialties. There are differences between FAA certification offices and FAA flight standards offices. They are not interchangeable. There are distinct differences in their responsibilities. Engineering rules are very different from rules for aircraft maintenance and pilots, also known as flight standards rules, because engineering rules only speak to manufacturing and modification. Part 21 through Part 35 deals with design and certification of aircraft, engines, propellers, and components. Part 43 speaks to how instructions for maintaining aircraft will be written. Part 39 addresses the writing of airworthiness directives that correct for operational or design weaknesses. To be clear, these rules under Subchapter C are about certification and airworthiness standards, not flight standards. The term standards means a level of quality or attainment. Industry engineers who follow and work in these engineering rules support the industry. An engineer does not have to be certificated by the FAA to perform their engineering tasks. At the same time, FAA engineers work with manufacturers and other engineers. They are not active members in the day-to-day aviation. FAA engineers are not in FAA's flight standards divisions. They don't fly aircraft, and they don't fix aircraft. That must be distinctly understood. Now let's move on to Title 14, CFR Subchapter D, as in Delta, is about airmen. These are the rules for certification of pilots, flight engineers, repairmen, and/or airframe and power plant technicians, as well as those who train pilots or technicians. Rules like Part 61 are for FAA certificated folks who fly aircraft, while Part 65 is for FAA certificated folks who repair and inspect aircraft, who are authorized to release an aircraft to service. These are the fundamental rules for all pilots and technicians. We'll discuss more rules for pilots and technicians in a few moments. Again, FAA engineers and engineers in general are not FAA certificated. They have engineering degrees. Pilots and aircraft technicians, including flight standards FAA inspectors, are FAA certificated and must hold those certificates to do their job, whether they are pilots, aircraft technicians, or repairmen. This, again, is an important distinction. Title 14, CFR, Subchapter E, as in Echo, are airspace rules. For example, Part 71 is where different types of aircraft are permitted to fly in the National Airspace System, the NAS, and places they are not permitted to fly. Again, for a later episode. Title 14, CFR, Subchapter F, as in Foxtrot, are air traffic and general operating rules that address topics like instrument flight rules and different operating rules for all aircraft that are managed and considered by air traffic control. Title 14, CFR, Subchapter G, as in Golf, are rules for air carriers and operators for compensation or hire and their certification and operations. Subchapter G focuses on air carrier certifications under Part 119, while Parts 121, 125, 129, and 135 operations are the airlines and assorted air operators. Just as importantly, each Part 121, Part 125, Part 129, and Part 135 operator has more extensive rules for their FAA certificated pilots and their FAA certificated technicians, but not for their engineers. Some operators don't even have engineers. These distinctions must be understood, especially when we speak about the NTSB in the next episode. When I said we'll talk about pilots and technicians obeying other rules, then in subchapter D, these are what I refer to. Each operator operates differently. American Airlines operates differently than United Airlines. FedEx operates differently than UPS. They may perform the same service, whether passenger or cargo, but their operations are unique, such as where they fly or what airplanes they operate, etc. Yet each of them have to follow the same rules under subchapter G. In subchapter C, I stated that FAA engineers are not in FAA flight standards. Pilots and aircraft technicians are FAA certificated. Their fundamental rules are under subchapter D, but those who are employed by the airlines work under the air operator programs created under subchapter G. Incidentally, Part 137 is the rule for certification and operation of agricultural aircraft. Part 139 is for certification of airports. Title 14 CFR, subchapter H, as in hotel, is about schools and other certificated agencies. They are the rules for Part 141 pilot schools, or Part 147 maintenance technical schools, and Part 145 repair stations of all complexities. And we will soon be looking at Part 147 schools because the rule has been devastated by special interests. Title 14 CFR subchapter I, as in India. Well, we'll find there airports, which are the rules for, you guessed it, airports. And Title 14 CFR subchapter K, as in kilo, are administrative regulations. These rules are important because they focus on specifically Part 183, which are designees. Again, we won't talk about this now, but we will in future episodes. The FAA also has different policies and guidance to assist in oversight, such as advisory circulars, orders, notices, and others. We won't cover these in detail now, but they allow the FAA to keep up with changes in industry, like technology changes, without waiting for the lengthy and expensive rulemaking process to be worked through. One other thing, the FAA cannot arbitrarily bring accusations against the certificate holder under subchapter B. They have, according to Title 14 CFR Section 13.244, have the burden of proof. So when a violation is brought against the certificate holder by the FAA, it's the FAA's responsibility, their burden of proof, to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the certificate holder had violated the rules. We will talk about that again when we get into the NTSB episode next. I had a great 17-year career with the FAA. I played many different roles in many parts of the Title 14 regulations. I still instruct FAA inspectors, both veteran and new hire, passing on, hopefully, what I learned. On the bookshelf behind me are relics of the FAA's guidance and federal regulations from the old days, kind of a reminiscence of the Flintstone regulatory years, also known as pre-digital. These hardcover documents came from a time when technology didn't make an FAA inspector's job easier, or so is believed. But I made many positive contributions to safety, at least I feel I did. My safety impacts rode under the radar. No one would know them because being a safety inspector isn't about recognition, but about results, which is a safe aviation industry. As for the FAA is a proactive agency. They always have been. They are designed to anticipate problems by employing means of gathering data. They use audits, on-site surveillance, safety assurance system information, and other ways to get in front of their certificate holders' unsafe acts. At times, it's a flood of information that is now taking the form of virtual inspections, which is a very unreliable way to conduct surveillance. But facts are facts. The FAA is losing control of the industry. Some say it's political. Some say it's nepotism of some sorts, while others say technology has outpaced the FAA's ability to keep up. I say it's all three: politics, nepotism, technology, and quite a few things more. I believe the majority of the FAA's internal problems start with management, specifically upper management, where bureaucratic titles don't guarantee qualification. It's hard to imagine how some people who've occupied the FAA administrator's office could be such poor managers. The FAA's mandate comes from the two chambers of Congress. It's within this twin-chamber three-ring circus that the FAA's effectiveness has been beaten to a shadow of its former self. Every year, the U.S. Congress ties up the FAA with idiotic political theater, like continuing resolutions. What is a continuing resolution? Well, a continuing resolution, known as a CR, is a temporary measure used by the U.S. Congress to fund federal government operations when appropriations bills have not been passed, preventing a government shutdown. What a CR tends to be is an unnecessary political football used by both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, to score political points against the other. CRs are band-aids for when the two political parties are at odds to finalize the necessary appropriations bills for the new fiscal year. But in reality, a CR is a game of chicken to see what side will blink first, and then the drama is played out in the cooperative mainstream media. CRs are basically an excuse for lawmakers not to cooperate, to not put the U.S. citizens' needs first. The bottom line with the continuing resolutions is that aviation safety is compromised. Various FAA offices cannot plan their regulatory activities past the next month. What does that mean? It means thousands of certificates requiring surveillance, oversight, safety investigations on behalf of the flying public are subjected to delays in regulatory action. Cancellations of oversight and even the certifying of new air agencies are delayed, or an applicant pulls out of certification because of cost overruns, all because of congressional political theater. All activities and responsibilities are compromised. Think about the consequences of playing politics with what the FAA does for air safety. Then there's the nepotistic. Several years ago, upper management decided to fix what wasn't broken. The FAA's upper echelons decided to redraw the FAA map. They spent millions to combine 7 regions into one bloated and ineffective one. And the problems that came out of this were it took years for everyone in the FAA to figure out where they belonged. Internal FAA divisions changed their responsibilities, were combined, or were broken up. The central control for all 5 timelines, not counting international, was in headquarters in Washington, D.C., which only operated between the hours of 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Monday to Friday, Eastern Standard Time. There is no overtime in the government, so important decisions were deferred. Decisions were delayed. Actions took days instead of hours. Headquarters became swollen with friends and relatives, not quality. And divisional confusion continued for years to this day. But the bureaucrats dug in. They chipped away at the FAA's relationship with industry Ineffective administrator after ineffective administrator led the FAA into its present death spiral. Think about the consequences of nepotism in a government agency like the FAA. Then there's the technology and change. Ever since the end of World War II, aviation has been in a technology race against itself. For instance, the reciprocating engine was eclipsed by the more powerful and efficient turbine engine. Efficient, but not right away. It took decades for the turbine engine to reach its glory day of high efficiency, and that's the point. Let's use as an example the DC-8 and 707 were the golden geese of the 1960s. They were four-engine, diesel-guzzling airliners with a three-man cockpit, cable-driven controls, all-metal alloys, analog instrumentation that were capable of international travel. Today, the international airliner has two fuel-efficient engines, a two-person cockpit, fly-by-wire, mostly composite, with digital instrumentation. The challenge for the FAA was and is to stay not just apprised of technology advancements, but to be proactively staying in front of the technology advancements in industry. At the same time, they juggle multiple certificates and their oversight responsibilities. Then there were the changes brought about by deregulation. In 1978, the aviation industry changed dramatically. Airlines became competitive. Again, the FAA had to adjust to meet the new changes. Repair stations started to become more complex and to meet the needs of the airline industry. More repair stations, more oversight. Regional airlines grew in numbers and complexity to be part of the airline industry market. More regional airlines, more oversight. Cargo operations went from supplemental operations to overnight cargo operations. More cargo operators, more oversight. Yet the FAA still wasn't increasing manpower or training to meet the new needs until accidents in the 1990s and the early 2000s changed the game. This meant more catch-up for the FAA with decreasing opportunities to be proactive. Think about the consequences of the FAA losing its proactive advantage in a safety environment. Then there was the COVID shutdowns. The vaccines were the most devastating mess the FAA had undergone, and it wasn't a good time to go through it. The COVID shutdown meant FAA inspectors were forbidden to visit certificate holders for years. They literally weren't allowed to visit certificates the FAA was responsible for conducting regular oversight on. Annual inspections were postponed, even overseas inspections. New certifications, also known as new businesses, were delayed or canceled because these applicants couldn't afford to complete the certification process. International FAA certificated air agencies were ignored for 3 years. Inspectors were using useless tools such as virtual to replace on-site inspections. International flight offices that at one time were in the general area of the different countries they oversaw were pulled back into the United States, where they became dependent on more severe budget restrictions, limiting access to air agencies they regulated. Worse, in 2019, COVID made that divide even greater by stopping all international inspector oversight overseas. Then in 2021, President Biden, through former Secretary Buttigieg, put forth a government-wide mandate stating that all government workers had to receive the COVID vaccine or be fired. In January 2022, many FAA inspectors responded to the threat. The FAA started to lose its greatest number of inspectors and office managers at one time. These were seasoned, experienced inspectors and managers. It would take months the time the FAA did not have before the FAA could even begin replacing the lost inspectors. Remember what we talked about the continuing resolution earlier in this episode. The postponed surveillance and oversight to this day has never caught up. And what this also meant was that the FAA's average experience levels per inspector workforce dropped dramatically. Before COVID, each office had a combined inspector workforce experience level of decades of experience in all industry specialties such as general aviation, helicopters, airlines, air ambulances, authorized inspectors, designees, flying and tech schools. But since it takes each new hire inspector at least 7 years to spool up to being effective, to actually learn the job, the office experience level will take a decade at minimum to even reach the pre-COVID mandate numbers. In the meantime, the industry continues to technologically advance. At the same time, FAA veterans who did take the vaccine were doubling up on training their new hires while simultaneously conducting backlogged oversight of their certificates. These folks were now starting to retire, just as the inspector workforce needed the most. To some in the public, this may not seem inconvenient, but to the aviation industry, it would prove ruinous. It also seemed to be something the media, the mainstream media, didn't take note of. And for new certificate applicants, the inspectors overseeing their certification process were now new hires, unable to move the certification process through to closeout because they lacked the experience and knowledge to do so. So other divisions were now carrying the load of an ever-increasing number of backlogged applicants. Other areas of the FAA were also experiencing shortages in engineering and flight standards, and the effects of these shortages were harming other FAA activities. Consider the consequences of COVID over the regulating of all the aviation industry for years. Are we really surprised there are so many aviation accidents? The once promising ability for FAA to self-improve was a program called the Flight Standards Evaluation Program. Known as FSEP, it became one of the first irresponsible victims of FAA's new upper management. The FSEP program, which between the years 2005 and 2020, an ISO 9001 program, was successfully making the FAA consistent across the world. FAA offices in South Florida were becoming consistent with FAA offices in Alaska. This was a goal of pre-COVID FAA, to take the FAA beyond its roots in 1958 to self-improvement in the 21st century. And it was working. However, incoming FAA management determined the FSEP program to be a liability to their agendas. The constant self-evaluations would expose waste and corruption. FSEP was a watchdog that prevented the freedom to make the FAA bloated again and feed off the money. The FSEP program was canceled using COVID shutdowns as a smokescreen. This led to two problems. For one, the FAA wouldn't self-audit anymore. The very tool the FAA successfully employed to improve safety in aviation by improving efficiency in itself was now being discontinued for no good reason. And two, with the FSEP cancellation within the FAA still communicated to industry that the FAA still expected industry to continue their own self-audits, while the FAA did not. In other words, do as I say, not as I do. The FAA has to return to the FSEP program. Consider the consequences of the FAA's decision not to self-improve. Then there was the DEI programs. FAA management, including Secretary Buttigieg, employed diversity, equity, and inclusion into their hiring practices. No matter how one feels about DEI policies, they do not belong in any safety primary business or government agency. There is nothing to convince any professional that hiring strictly on race or gender instead of merit-based benefits aviation safety. The airlines and agencies that employ DEI are now showing how those short-term popular policies were wrong. DEI hiring practices, like all nepotistic type hiring practices, introduces corruption. Former Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg promoted the DEI practices throughout all the Department of Transportation, implementing DEI hiring practices and policies throughout the FAA. Consider the consequences of unsafe hiring practices at the FAA as it affects safety in the aviation industry. And finally, training would become the most far-reaching FAA problem. As the FAA continues to moving towards 100% virtual training and limits its on-the-job training programs, the FAA will continue to sacrifice the possibility of restoring its aviation inspector workforce's quality and experience levels. Adopted as cost savings, virtual instruction cripples the knowledge requirements of FAA inspectors. FAA inspectors used to learn in a classroom environment, encouraging team building and networking, relationships and friendships that would last for decades of FAA employment and beyond. They would follow that up with on-the-job trainings at levels 2 and 3. The decisions to eliminate classroom training came from DEI hires, management types who either never trained in the classroom or saw the dollar savings as a reason to deprive the workforce of useful training. Contract instructors, such as myself, many of them former FAA inspectors, started to leave. Some of them were disgusted with the useless training model the FAA had turned to. Then unqualified course mentors were and are being hired to create or revise FAA courses, to substitute opinions in place of facts. And worse, they were and are hired without any practical aviation experience. The FAA will soon make matters even worse. Forced to save money, the training will start to become even less reliable. FAA classes will limit industry classes. Why? Because the FAA will phase out qualified contract instructors to save money. It's already started to happen. The industry doesn't want to get a part of that. Then there's again the double standard. Low-quality FAA courses taught by FAA will take the path of the canceled FSEP program. What this means is the FAA will require industry's certificate holders to incorporate the best training methods for safety at the same time the FAA is skimping on the quality of its own training. Again, do as I say, not as I do. Industry isn't stupid. They will see this for what it is, a break in trust and a break in consistency. The FAA as a safety regulatory agency will be seen as hypocritical, and industry will be right. Since the FAA has weakened its own quality, the question becomes, how can the FAA presume to demand quality from the industry? Let's revisit the FAA's mission statement. As is written, our continuing mission is to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. It is safe to say, no pun intended, that government bureaucrats, politicians, and FAA's upper management have mocked the FAA's mission statement. They've crippled the FAA inspector workforce's ability to be effective, that their mission to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system anywhere has been seriously compromised, possibly beyond immediate repair. If I was to use a baseball analogy, it would be my learned opinion that the FAA, which at one time was the major leagues, even worthy of the World Series, has slipped down past AA, through single A minor leagues, descending through the college leagues, then high school. If Secretary Duffy doesn't act swiftly and decisively, there will be nothing left for the FAA but the little leagues and T-ball. But that's my opinion. Until next time, I'm Stephen Carbone, reminding you to tab. Think safe, act safe, be safe. Take care.